Hi everyone, my name is Catherine Shriver and I'm the host of the 2025 Companion Lecture Series, which goes along with Norgard Design's 2025 Global Project. This year's global project is called The Beaded Word, so today I'm going to be talking about the work of JeffreyGibson, who is a contemporary artist who works not only in beadwork, but also in painting, sculpture, video, but incorporates text in a lot of his work, so it's really appropriate for this year's global project. You may notice that I'm not in the most glamorous looking setting right now, but I'm actually coming to you from Aramont School of Arts and Crafts, where I'm going to be assisting artist Carly Owens-Weiss in a beadwork class that she's teaching here, which is really exciting. I'll also be interviewing Carly later this week for this series, so stay tuned for her interview as well. So you may have seen JeffreyGibson's work before. He is a very prominent beadwork artist working today. And the piece on this screen here is an excellent example of the kind of work that he's very well known for. It's from 2015 and it's called American History. And it is beaded. And the text here is woven right into it, I believe using square stitch largely. And this is also a great example of the way that JeffreyGibson uses text in his work. So the piece reads, American history is longer, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. JB. And that JB at the end stands for author James Baldwin, who originally wrote this text. So James Baldwin, as a Black American author, is thinking about the ways in which American history is often told and taught, and what is often left out of that narrative, including the experiences of people of color and indigenous people. So when JeffreyGibson transcribes this and weaves this directly into this work, it's not only bringing those ideas right into the forefront of this piece, he's also embedded it into this very contemporary looking abstract sculpture. And so to put this text up here is reminding us that this is still true and these stories are still not getting told. And the idea of American history is still much longer, more terrible, more beautiful than what is often still being told today. So JeffreyGibson was born in Colorado Springs and is a member of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians and is also of Cherokee descent. He grew up in a lot of different cities in the United States and also spent some time in Germany and Korea in his young life. He studied in Chicago and also in the UK. And so you can see why Jeffrey might be thinking a lot about how things change in different contexts. You know, he moved around a lot in his young life and also into his adulthood, and has spoken about being very mindful in the way that you enter a new community and how he himself was perceived differently and how he might have thought of himself differently in these new places. So if you think about Jeffrey being somebody of mixed indigenous heritage living in the United States and then living abroad, where first and foremost he might be read as American, thinking about how that shifts one's identity and also how it shifts the way that you relate to the people around you. So Jeffrey might be most well known for these amazing punching bag works that he makes. In this piece here, you can really see that these works are all made on actual found punching bags. That's why he leaves that Everlast logo that's so identifiable, clear, peeking out from the beaded work. So when Jeffrey's using these punching bags, he really wants us to think about that form and that object and think about how it might stand in for a body that's being beaten up, or think about this association of anger and frustration with the words that he's inscribing on them. And also just thinking about this bodily relationship with this thing that you punch, or that can even stand in for a body that's being punched. So the punching bag form does really interesting things with the text that JeffreyGibson sources for his pieces. And so this piece here is called I Will Survive, with these words beaded around the punching bag here. And of course, this title is pulled from the very famous Gloria Gaynor song, I Will Survive. And this song itself has connotations of not only like resistance and resilience, but also like both joy and frustration at having to fight for one's survival in different ways. And it's associated with a certain sort of Black feminism and broader feminism. It's also associated with maybe certain kinds of dance culture and queer culture. And so by putting this on a punching bag in beads, Jeffrey Gibson is making us think about the way these words mean something different when they're inscribed on, like literally on a form that is meant to absorb violence. Yet this piece is also speaking in that way to joy and fun and dancing to pop songs with your friends. And that's also kind of signaled with the like really exuberant and exciting patterning that Jeffrey uses. All right, so here's an example of some of Jeffrey Gibson's painting, which you can see uses a lot of the same patterning and imagery as his beadwork and also incorporates text. The text in his paintings often looks different than the beadwork, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. You can see in that central rectangle in the middle of the painting there that it says, "Don't you know your life itself," which is also the title of the painting. And this is taken from a David Bowie song. So again, Jeffrey Gibson is using pop culture references and a sort of like joyful dance culture, and then transposing it on this painting, which makes us think a little bit more about the words as they're contextualized outside of maybe like a pop culture sphere, and thinking maybe a little bit more about the political weight of the words. But the imagery in the background with all of these amazing colors and this beautiful beadwork still kind of has some of that like affirmative, expressive, and like joyful quality. So you can also see here that Jeffrey Gibson's using a lot of triangles, and he uses triangles throughout all of his work. And he speaks to the triangle as this way of thinking about an indigenous or an indigenized kind of abstraction that speaks back to the very straight-lined grid of the Western canon of abstract painting from the modernist period. And so the grid was like a structure that a lot of formalist modernist painters were using and thinking about critically. And Jeffrey Gibson uses the triangle as a way to still participate in this very painterly and technical and formal sense of painting, but is pulling the triangle from a more indigenous history of abstraction. And Jeffrey Gibson also very interestingly speaks to the way that the triangle in indigenous and different indigenous cultures is often used symbolically. In most abstract practices, the abstracted forms are not devoid of meaning, but they're actually simplified storytelling structures. So the triangle in many like indigenous artworks traditionally can speak to mountains or trees or villages or any number of things that they could stand in for. And so rather than the kind of white Western tradition of abstraction, which is kind of thinking more about trying to empty out symbolism and storytelling and think purely about shape and form, Jeffrey Gibson is participating in this very formalist and like highly technical painterly exercise, but is skewing it to think more about like a more robust indigenous storytelling, a more robust sort of like just visual practice that doesn't disregard meaning that is relevant to cultures outside of the colonial narrative. This is another example of some of Jeffrey Gibson's painting from around the same time period. So this one is from 2021 and is called She Never Dances Alone. And again, we can see that Jeffrey Gibson has beaded the text of the title, She Never Dances Alone, around the edge in this frame here, and then is also incorporated the text running throughout the painted image in that same sort of triangular block letter. We again, of course, see the triangles, Jeffrey Gibson's signature experiment with indigenous symbology and patterning. And then what is atypical for this painting is that here we also see an image of a woman's face kind of peering out from underneath some of the triangles. And then we also see like maybe a glimpse of something that might reference the American flag directly under. So this piece is actually referring to one of Jeffrey Gibson's earlier pieces. And this piece was actually a multi-channel video piece, which was screened in Times Square on all the different screens in that giant public space. And so this was incredibly significant because the video piece depicted Sarah Ortegon, a very famous jingle dancer, doing jingle dance in all like this, taking over this huge space essentially of Times Square with traditional Ojibwe dancing. And so Jeffrey Gibson was talking about this as like a salute to Indigenous femininity because jingle dances are traditionally performed by women. And so in 2021, a year later, Jeffrey is going back to that piece and kind of recycling those ideas or referring to those ideas and incorporating, I believe Sarah Ortegon's face here and reiterating the powerful statement that she never dances alone. So I'm just going to cycle through a few more examples of Jeffrey Gibson's painting here. This one is slightly more recent from 2023 and is called Love Me With All My Faults. Here we have a beaded panel that sits underneath the painting that is beaded with the title. And then on top of that, we have just this like really interesting geometric painting that is kind of another permutation of Jeffrey Gibson's experimentations with form and geometry and color. And here's another one from 2023, which is, again, returning to this beaded frame, but is using text and the title a little bit more differently. This one is called Upside Down. And here you can see in all those little like cells that are painted with these really interesting patterns and triangles, we have like kind of remixes of that, again, the sort of triangular block letter text that says upside down in different configurations throughout. And so again, we're thinking, Jeffrey Gibson's thinking maybe a little bit more about kind of formal qualities of text and integrating the words and therefore the ideas that they depict into the actual formal composition of the painting. And here's a really beautiful and interesting example of some of Jeffrey Gibson's earlier work. This one's from 2015 and it's called Thinking of You. Here we don't see any text necessarily printed or painted onto the picture plane, but we do see a really interesting incorporation of pattern and triangles and also like really, really beautiful materialities. So it looks like this whole painting is glowing and metallic, but I think that's just his use of color. It's just rawhide, it's just acrylic paint on rawhide. And so in that background where you have this really kind of, in this painting, it looks a little bit like it's glowing, but I believe it's just because of the coloration of the rawhide. So you can imagine that really sort of warm, soft texture underneath that paint that's peeking out on the edge there. And then this one I included because I had never seen anything like this from Jeffrey Gibson before. And this is another older one from 2015, and it's called Documents. And again, here it's stretched on a deer rawhide that's a little bit more like an unprocessed skin. Here we can really see the relationship of the modernist grid that Jeffrey Gibson's using, and then thinking through permutations of that through triangles, and even we have a circle at the bottom, and just thinking about ways of creating form that don't fit into perfect rectangles and how to negotiate that visually as an artist, but also through meaning and symbology. I'm really excited to show you this piece because I think it's not only a really interesting example of a slightly more hybrid kind of work that Jeffrey Gibson makes, which is incorporating not just beadwork and painting, but also different kinds of embellishment practice and a little bit of like sculptural practices as well with that really beautiful custom frame that's all the way around. You can see on the slide here that this piece, which is called Speaking to the Trees, Kissing the Ground, which is what is written in that painting there. But you can see on this slide that it's labeled under the category of whimsies. And this is a kind of work that Jeffrey Gibson has made in reference to this particular kind of beadwork that was made largely around the Niagara Falls area by Native people who were trying to appeal to like a certain white settler tourist market. So these pieces, they were made into pincushions and change purses, and both tried to appeal to what was perceived as a white women's taste, but also trying to appeal a little bit to the more problematic allure of native beadwork to white people, which may be borrowed from a certain kind of exoticism or incorrect sort of mythology. And so these pieces are often, were often thought of as like not quite native enough and also not quite European enough, and thus are super interesting to a lot of Indigenous artists working today. And because also of this, because they kind of combine this cultural exchange or cultural confusion and a very particular sort of commercial form, and that they were being made to sell in a trade market, um, they speak a lot to the way that colonialism and kind of intercultural contact has produced different kinds of material and artistic form. And so Jeffrey Gibson is exploring what this might mean in this piece, and again is not being straightforward, but is using a lot of his own typical moves of the triangle patterning and the text, but is here using a little bit more imagery, which might, like, the snake is a heavily symbolic creature in a lot of different cultures. He's also taking these leaves, which maybe might be suggestive to some of us in North America of like native beadwork specifically, but are ambiguous. And then we also have these medallion shapes that might point to or suggest the native form of the medicine wheel, but they also definitely reference like political buttons as well. And so this whimsy format is a really interesting reference for Jeffrey Gibson because it has that ambiguity built in and that layering of context and that shifting context that he's really interested in built in. And so these pieces are also considered his whimsy pieces, largely because they are inspired by forms similar to that little bird that might be a change purse or just a pincushion or a wall hanging novelty. And here he's pushed the bird form to like an absolute limit and has used a lot of different beadwork techniques as well as like other sorts of sculptural material to make these really lush and beautiful. I just imagine them being heavy and kind of like almost cuddly in their shape. Really interesting bird sculptures. I actually only encountered this piece when I was doing the research for this presentation, and I included it because I think it's just wildly fabulous. This sculpture, as you can see, is a piece of furniture, and it's based on this form of the kissing chair, which is a real kind of chair that is built sort of like this in like usually a two-seater structure where the chairs are connected but facing opposite ways. And this was meant to perhaps let people have conversations with each other without turning their heads. And so it's a kind of fabulous and novel sort of idea for a piece of furniture. And Jeffrey Gibson at the time of making it had access to working with a really prolific and skilled furniture maker. And so that opened up this opportunity for him to explore this very ornate and imaginative piece of like form of furniture. And when he was exploring this form, he was thinking about the idea of like a communal throne and thinking about what it might feel like in an imaginary planet where you are able to completely invent a sort of mythology and culture for yourself. What sort of like exciting and like grandiose aesthetics would you want to have for your imaginary realm? And I think it's also really interesting that Jeffrey picked up on this very interconnected and also very fanciful form of furniture, because if he's thinking so much about the way that people relate to one another in different cultures and contexts, then I think this sort of like weirdly interconnected, like slightly nonsensical, but also slightly like socially oriented form makes a lot of sense for him to explore. All right, so these magnificent figures are actually even larger than life size, and they are, in fact, beaded from head to toe. And when Jeffrey Gibson is making these, he's referring to a couple of things. First, he's certainly thinking about the regalia worn during powwows and other kinds of indigenous dance practices, but he's also thinking about queer nightclubs and a tradition of like really elaborate and often handmade dance costumes and fashions. And so both of these contexts, again, are intersecting, and they're layering these environments and communities that are coming together to affirm their presence, to express joy, to build culture, to make connections, and also to stand together in resistance, as well as and just like, again, active joy. So I know I've spoken quite a bit about the way that Jeffrey Gibson uses text in his work to create meaning, but because we are doing the Beaded Word project this year, I wanted to pause and talk very specifically about the way that visually beads and text work together in Jeffrey Gibson's work. So you can see that these two pieces are entirely beaded, save for the fringe on the side, which, as an aside, are actually called jingles. And these forms, I believe, were actually formed originally from reused tobacco canisters and are featured on a lot of indigenous regalia in North America, and are also the jingles that are used in the jingle dance, which was featured in the video piece that I showed you from Times Square. So to go back to my point, the beadwork here, I believe, is square stitch. And Jeffrey Gibson talks about having to think about creating a font type that would actually fit into the structure of this weave pattern. So Jeffrey Gibson designed a font that he uses largely in all of his beadwork that fits specifically into the square stitch. So I want you all to think about that as you're designing your beaded word pieces. How much are you negotiating back and forth with the peyote structure? All right. But because Jeffrey Gibson's thinking really actively about the way that his material is going to change and negotiate the way his text can look, he's also using text very differently across the media and the different kinds of beadwork that he uses. So here you can see that this one is embroidered beads. And because it's embroidered beads, he has a really different sort of ability to create fluid line. So he took this opportunity to, instead of using instead of using block letters, here he's using his own handwriting and transcribing it into beads. And I think if you look between these two slides, there's a really different sort of impact that these different texts make, thinking about the very personal intention of Jeffrey Gibson's actual handwriting beaded here in this very like first person text that says, I want to make you feel free, versus the more the slightly more aphoristic or even confrontational or even political feeling, I don't belong to you, you don't belong to me, in the way they're presented in these like more poster-like block letters. And then finally, again, I wanted to return to the painting works. This one is from 2020. It says, what we want is free. And again, you see along the beaded border here that he's using that block text, or that block text that's dictated by the square stitch. However, this really kind of difficult and hard to read and abstracted font that he uses in his paintings, you can also see is responding actually to the way that he uses patterning and geometry in his paintings, as well as color. So we can see that he's formed these words within these little, like within this kind of like grid, which we know that he thinks about and works with, but he's also largely incorporating, again, the triangles into the way that he's forming his letters. So wherever he can, a word like this, or a letter like this W here, is created out of largely triangles. So that way they hold not just the letter and therefore create a word, they also are holding the symbology of the triangle, as I mentioned earlier, that in many different sorts of indigenous systems of abstraction are referencing mountains, trees, villages, people, many, many things. And so he's able to keep all of that storytelling and incorporate all of that into the meaning of the text. And I think it's interesting to think about why he reiterates his phrases so much within the same piece. It's called, the title is What We Want is Free. He's written What We Want is Free in beads, and he's also said What We Want is Free in this painting. And you can see that he's flipped it mirror image and set it twice forwards and backwards. And with all that different reiteration where it looks different and feels different every single time, again, he's playing this sort of overlaying of different meanings from the same thing, or overlaying of context and representing things differently multiple times. I thought I'd just close out by speaking about Jeffrey Gibson's recent project at the 2024 Venice Biennale. And this is an interesting project, not only because it's one of his largest and most recent, but also because Jeffrey was the very first Indigenous artist to be invited to the Venice Biennale in order to represent the United States of America. And Jeffrey thinks about the complicated feelings of having that be the position he was in. And so it's exciting, but also frustrating that he was the first all the way in 2024, and also being put to the particularly strange task of having to represent, as an Indigenous artist, the colonial entity essentially that's responsible for so much pain, destruction, and cultural erasure and violence, just as an artist. And so Jeffrey thought a lot about the actual site of the US Pavilion. This building is created with a style of architecture that references a Western classicism that was also used during the colonial period in the United States to signify a certain kind of colonial power. And so in order to step in authentically into this space, Jeffrey thought a lot about how to kind of use it critically. And so you see here these red kind of plinth-like platforms. They're referencing basically Greco-Roman columns, a very classicist sort of architectural form that's related to this architecture of power I was speaking about. And so Jeffrey makes them red, indigenizing them, and also makes them out of like a really fun, attractive material that almost looks like a playground. And he's talking about these when he's interviewed as a sort of like stage for people to take over. And what he does is he invites many different Indigenous artists and performers and scholars to come and take over the space through performances and lectures. The title of this exhibition was The Space in Which to Place Me, which is a phrase pulled from a poem by Oglala Lakota poet Layli Long Soldier, and again is like pulling our attention and speaking explicitly about the space or the place in which he is, in which we are when we're at this exhibition. So really, I just want to show you, this is an excellent summary of a lot of the different kinds of work that Jeffrey Gibson makes, and as well as the themes that he deals with. But there's just some fabulous photos, so I wanted to show them to you. And so here we have some more figures that are even more elaborate and kind of monumental than the ones I showed you earlier. And these also have, you can see on their like sort of garments they're wearing, this is like massively like exuberant, beautiful, and elaborate regalia that they're wearing. And they also incorporate some text and patterning that's pulled directly from Jeffrey Gibson's sort of like typical visual language of his paintings and beadwork. So because Jeffrey Gibson is taking the weight of being the first Indigenous artist to represent the US at the Venice Biennale very seriously, he's pulling in even more techniques and strategies than he typically does in his work. So this is something very new here. You can see that, of course, he's got this typical to Jeffrey painting with the triangles and the colors and the text. This one is called Care Gives My Life Something Extra, and it's also what's written on the painting, as usual. But you can see it also features kind of like tacked onto it these historical beadworks that Jeffrey himself has collected from unknown beadwork artists. So this piece here that's close up with the two flowers on the screen is by an unknown Columbia River Plateau artist, and it's from about 1920 and 1950. And so the act of not just collecting, but then reintegrating this work by another Indigenous artist into his piece here and putting it in the Venice Biennale is not just kind of like elevating this work onto the contemporary art stage and insisting that it's not just a trinket, it's not just an artifact, it is in fact incredibly impressive and beautiful art. But he's also referencing and kind of pulling in the weight and power of Indigenous artists that have come before him, right? So he's bringing in just this sort of sense of lineage and like artistic ancestry, and not only highlighting the long legacy of like really talented and smart and incredible Indigenous artists that have given us the beadwork techniques that he works with today, and the visual language and the conceptual grounding. But he's also, you know, calling them in and bringing them into the Venice Biennale to help kind of take over this space in a really big way. And so again, this is another work that's incorporating another piece of purchased beadwork in Jeffrey Gibson's collection. This one is called "We Will Be Known Forever by the Tracks That We Leave." And yeah, Jeffrey Gibson is taking the sense of legacy very seriously and thinking about what he's leaving behind, about how he's living now, and who he's calling in to be in power with, and also thinking about who kind of like has come before him to give him the artistic tools to make the work that he makes. This is another still from the video installation that went up in 2020 in Times Square. And so this was included in the Venice Biennale as well. And I also just wanted to mention that, as I said, that Jeffrey Gibson is incorporating and giving platform to actual performers in this space. He also did that previously in the Times Square piece too, and that was kind of like a smaller or like more condensed version. And so by taking over that space with like larger than life images and this video of Indigenous art and performance, and then also making space for actual performers to take that space over and indigenize that area, you're really shifting, like giving people the opportunity to feel what it would feel like to shift those centers of power into something not colonial. And I just wanted to end off by returning to what might be perhaps Jeffrey Gibson's most well-known form, which is the beaded punching bag. And obviously, this is a glorious example. Clearly, they pulled out all the stops for this huge exhibition. But I wanted to end on this one because if you see the text, the title of this piece is "We Hold These Truths to be Self-Evident," which is, of course, from the American Constitution. So, of course, very on theme, as he's at the Venice Biennale in the U.S. Pavilion representing the country. But I think also recontextualizing these words again on a punching bag, this idea of self-evident truths that we can all hold. I think at this particular political moment, or the political moment in 2024 as well, thinking about what these words mean, how they're used, how they're upheld, and then also just taking and transcribing text from the American Constitution onto a punching bag really changes how we read it and how it feels to read. And here's just a glorious install shot of what this piece looked like in the room it was installed in at the Biennale, painted all red in the center, coming out of this dome in the center of this room. I think it's very powerful and very strong. And I think the way that Jeffrey Gibson utilizes these, again, this repositioning of the text from the Constitution is a really interesting and powerful thing to end off on. All right, so that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you learned a lot and that you enjoyed this. I want to say that I barely just scratched the surface of all of the amazing work that Jeffrey Gibson has done and all the incredible conceptual and material complexity that holds. So I urge you to look into his work more online or go see a show if you have an exhibition local to you ever. Please keep your eyes out for that. His work is fabulous. So thank you so much, and please look out for the other lectures in this series. Coming up, I will be interviewing 4 artists who use beadwork and other media in their work, and we're going to speak about the themes of the global project and about their work and all things beads and otherwise. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy.